We've got 3 great presentations lined up for you this afternoon. I'd ask that you hold your questions till the end. We're going to have a question and answer discussion session. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Sarah Fleming. Sarah is a regional biologist for Ducks Unlimited. She has an educational background in zoology and wildlife science, responsible for DU's conservation programs in the state of New York. She'll kick off her presentations with the recently completed GLRI project on Lake Ontario. Sarah? Pull this up for you.
Leave this forever. Great. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Perfect. I have a tendency to talk a little bit with my hands, so if anybody's having difficulty hearing me, just somebody just kind of wave your hand, pay attention, stop talking to the slides type thing. But thank you for having me here today. I'm very excited to discuss our recently completed restoration project up in St. Lawrence area on Lake Ontario, Jefferson County, New York. We delivered this project, we completed it in February of 2012. We're currently in the monitoring stage right now, so our partners with SUNY ESF out of Syracuse and all the wonderful graduate students are collecting data on this recent project. And I'm here to share some of the preliminary observations from our monitoring efforts. Now, please understand as I go through, some of these are somewhat anecdotal observations because we haven't gone through any really strict data analysis yet, but I think the trends are very positive and I'm really excited to share some of the results with you. So my project focuses on the Lake Ontario watershed and restoration efforts, as I said, throughout that the Great Lakes region, or the Lake Ontario area, which is a little different than my colleagues who will be presenting later today who are focusing on Lake Erie. But Lake Ontario is actually unique in that the water levels in Lake Ontario are managed by a dam in the St. Lawrence. So the levels are kept relatively stable, and there's a little fluctuation that occurs naturally in this system. And as a result of this dam that was installed in the 1960s, we've seen a change in the marsh community along the within the coastal marshes. The map does a really good depiction. Just kind of, if you look at the colors in the 1959 map, this is pre-installation of the dam, you'll see that there was a diverse community of marsh meadow habitat. And then slowly, with these stable water conditions, as well as nutrients entering the system as a result of increased agricultural practices across New York State, we're starting to see this predominance of cattail in the system, and it's outcompeting a lot of our critical marsh habitat. And a result with this change in the system, we're seeing a decline in a lot of our critical keystone species, such as black terns, muskrats, Virginia rails, and northern pike. And as I said, our main focus is this narrowleaf cattail, which is an invasive species. And as you can see from the pictures there, it creates a sea of cattail. It's just a mat. It's a wall. It's completely choked in a lot of the channels that would have existed and the potholes that would have been there. And as well, it outcompetes a lot of our native sedges and rushes, which a lot of these keystone species rely on to meet their habitat needs. So there was a group of scientists that got together and said, we are really concerned about this declining population. What can we do about it? And they started focusing on what's called the fish habitat conservation strategy. Now, ideally, or obviously, this is a particular strategy that's focused on restoring the fisheries resources. But at the same time, I think it's a really good baseline for how we went about implementing our current project. And as I said, the benefits for restoring some of the fisheries habitat is also going to benefit some of the other species as well. So what they did was they sat down, they started to prioritize key areas up in St. Lawrence, Jefferson County area. And so these are the areas that historically supported a diversity of wildlife. And we really want to go back in and start restoring these conditions, given the current site conditions in Lake Ontario, understanding that we're not going to be seeing a lot of these water level fluctuations, as well. How we want to restore the property such that if we start to see changes in the system, they're going to function naturally and continue to function. So it's been a bit of a learning process. So once we've decided where we want to work, that we jumped into what was in the implementation phase, and then as well as the monitoring, because we wanted to take an adaptive management approach and figure out, learn from our mistakes, learn from this, and figure out how we can continue to improve upon our efforts. So SUNY ESF, in partnership with the FEMRIF, Fish and Wildlife Service, which is Fisheries Enhancement and Mitigation Research Fund, started to implement these strategies where they went into these cattail marshes and started opening up channels and potholes, creating these areas where fisheries, as well as other animals, can go in and utilize these resources. Monitoring efforts have been going on these sites since around 2009, and it was the data or the results from these monitoring efforts that actually led to the justification of our current project. The results from the previously completed projects through the FEMRA funding showed there was a reestablishment of connectivity through these channels. Fish were using the channels in a very short amount of time. There was evidence of reproductive use by northern pike specifically. And we also saw a very positive seed bank response. So when that soil was disturbed, it allowed for the germination of a lot of the native plant species that are currently being outcompeted by cattail. That's just a picture showing that very quickly afterwards we're seeing the plant communities come back. So we go back to our fishery strategy. If you remember that implementation, we say, well, great, results are supporting this. Let's continue to implement this. And we applied for, in partnership with SUNY, NOAA, and New York State DEC, a GLRI grant. And we focused on, as I said, priority areas that had been previously identified at French Creek Wildlife Management Area, which is in Jefferson County, and then as well on a private property in called Point Vivian, which is up in Alexandria Bay along the St. Lawrence. And specifically what we did was 2 of the project sites were to go in and open up channels and potholes with the goal of increasing interspersion of vegetative community, restoring the, to open water, pardon me, as well as restoring the access for a lot of species that currently are restricted. So, and then also we had another project at Carpenter's Branch, which is a water-controlled site at French Creek, where we went in and installed a fish ladder to allow for improved access for fish into one of these managed water control structure areas. I'm going to focus on the results from our channeling and potholes right now for this project. So this was delivered, as I said, in February, and the graduate students are currently ongoing right now collecting a lot of the data that you're seeing on this slide right now, excuse me, under the monitoring section. And just for a point of reference, so everybody kind of gets an idea of where I'm talking about, you know, we have Lake Ontario, French Creek were those 2 sites we had that were restored, as well within the cattail mats, as well as increasing the fish passage. And then the Alexandria Bay site is kind of an inlet bay area where we opened up channels and potholes as well. So the big question is, we end up with the pictures you see here, a sea of cattail. We went in with long reach excavators and kind of dug out these roughly 6-foot wide channels and potholes. And now the big question, is it functioning? You know, that's a picture that I took that picture back in June of this year. So you can see that it really is creating some open water, and we're hoping the animals are going to respond to this as well as the fish. Our monitoring efforts were not only based on the fisheries strategy, but also, of course, on our quality assurance program plan, which was required by NOAA and required by GLRI. Now, obviously, this is short term. We're looking at only a 2 to 3 year period to be evaluating the system, but it will provide a good baseline. And what we ended up doing is we compared the treatment sites, so sites that had been recently restored, to reference sites in the area that had not been restored. And so this will allow us to kind of evaluate overall post-enhancement strategies and priorities for the future. So very quickly, I'm just going to run through some of our methods and some of the preliminary results, as I said, that we've seen. Water level hydrology, water levels and hydrology were evaluated by installing water level loggers and staff gauges. We're evaluating how the water levels change and fluctuate not only in the newly restored channels and potholes, but also in areas where we have water control capabilities. And we're kind of comparing how the plant community and the animals are responding to that. Similarly, there's been a strong correlation between nutrient loading and plant community. So we wanted to go in and get an idea of what the nutrient levels were like, and then how the plant community may or may not be responding. As well as trophic levels play an important role in our wetland ecosystems. And there's been a strong relationship between the amount of plants that are there, perhaps the amount of algae, amount of debris, and the invertebrate communities that might be present. So we went in and wanted to look at invertebrate communities and composition, with an idea that these are the primary food sources for a lot of our species that we're targeting. So if the invertebrates are there, hopefully we'll be seeing we provide the habitat and the food sources, we'll be seeing a positive response from some of our keystone species. So this is just some fun pictures of graduate students out in the field working. You know, it was really labor intensive for them installing these water level gauges. The water quality samples have been collected, but I'm sure as many of you know, it's a long, tedious process. So they're currently in the lab right now, and next year we'll have hopefully some solid results to present. For our wetland vegetation, we set up this by setting up transects in the wetland, and we used meter square quadrats. We went in and kind of looked at the total species composition as well as percent cover. Now this was done during the peak growing season. And it's to kind of give you a quick idea, the picture to I guess it would be your left, that kind of shows a schematic of what was done. That was actually one of our drafting plans that was delivered, so that kind of gives you an overlaid on the site. And the transects were set up so that they cross some of our key areas where we wanted to evaluate, so not only through the channels and potholes, but we also used the material from those channels and potholes and left it in the wetland and created habitat mounds. And the reason for that was to try to create some difference in the topography and also to see how the plant community respond in some of the areas that might be just a little bit out of the water. They were about 2 feet tall. So we wanted to, as I said, the transects went through those areas to evaluate the plant community as a whole. And the picture on the bottom here, you can kind of see the pink images. I know it's a little grainy, but that's one of our habitat mounds. So you can see that there was a very positive, very quick, this was just restored in March, response from some of our very beneficial plant species. There's sedges out there, rushes, and predominantly you're seeing smartweed in that picture. You are seeing some cattails come back, but at the same time it's positive that we're seeing that transition as soon as the soil is disturbed. So basic results that have been presented was that on areas where the habitat mounds were, there was less cattail than on some of our reference sites. Areas that were drier, so some of the areas that perhaps were higher in elevation in the marsh, had less species richness and as well as less coverage of non-cattail related species. So ultimately the cattail seems to be responding in areas that are a little bit drier, and we're getting a positive response from sedges and rushes that are a little bit more moist. Similarly, restoration of the native species was site-specific, which makes sense. You know, it's going to be based on the seed bank as well as other environmental variables. So we're kind of looking a little bit further into that. And submerged aquatic vegetation was not present in the newly restored potholes and channels, but for obvious reasons, it takes a little bit more time to establish. So we're going to keep looking at this and see how it goes in the next few years. Another group of organisms we wanted to look at were fish. This led right into our fish conservation strategy. Angling is really, really important up in that area. We've seen a decrease in northern pike, and so who basically rely on these marsh meadow habitats that are no longer in existence, or very minimized in Lake Ontario. So we wanted to provide these channels with the hopes that they will go in there and use them for spawning, and try to get an idea of, you know, the spawning success and rates in these newly restored areas. Muskrats are also an important keystone species because they can play a significant role in controlling cattail density in our wetlands. So we wanted to kind of see how they responded to these channels. Similarly, marsh bird species are on a decline, and so we wanted to see if by opening up and creating interspersion in different plant communities, they may respond. Reptiles and amphibians are very sensitive to changes in their environment, and so we wanted to look at how they were responding to some of these newly restored areas as well, because there's a lot of species at risk in New York State within that category. Some very basic preliminary results. As I said, we're still working on this, but we detected 12 least bitterns, which is one of our focal species, and areas where water levels were able to be controlled. So for instance, at Carpenter's Branch, where we had the ability to regulate the water levels, we detected a higher number of least bitterns there. No focal species were observed at French Creek and our newly restored sites, but we're hoping that maybe next year we'll see a positive response. There were 2 times as many turtles observed in areas with water control capabilities compared to sites that didn't have water control capabilities. But we were noticing Blanding's turtles, which is a state-threatened species, in the area, so that's very positive. Young of the year, northern pike and adults were using the newly restored wetlands and channels within a matter of months. February, we had these channels restored, and they were capturing them at the end of March. So they were finding these sites very, very quickly, which is very positive. Similarly, we saw American bitterns using Point Vivian, which is one of our restored sites, and they were not located at the reference site. So that's, you know, birds seem to be responding, but this is very preliminary data. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move to another GLRI project that we're a partner with TNC. This is at Lakeview, which is a little bit further south from where we're currently working. Same county and up in the Lake Ontario watershed. And we did the same thing. We opened up channels and potholes. You guys can, this is actually a picture of the completed work. You can kind of get a feel some of these open areas, and we mimicked them off of some historical imagery that kind of showed where these channels may have been. And TNC is collecting the monitoring data right now. This project again was completed in March of last year, and we're seeing the same trends. The same idea that we're seeing positive responses from young of the year northern pike. There was no signs prior to the restoration for muskrats. Now we're starting to see some visible signs. And similarly, black terns, you know, we're seeing some positive responses from black terns, an increase of 1 pair to 1.5. So like I said, very anecdotal observations right now, but good trends. Another project, actually, this is in Lake Erie. This is up in Lake Erie, Long Point, which is around Port Rowan in Ontario. A partner organization, Long Point Waterfowl, is doing similar work to what we're doing, with the idea they're going in and opening up channels and potholes in Phragmites stands and seeing how animals are responding. And these particular results have been published in Wetlands, and they'll be available sometime this year. And what they found were the same trends. Bird abundance was responding to these restored sites, marsh bird species richness was increasing, invertebrate communities were increasing, and we were seeing a positive response from our plant communities. So in summary, our short-term observations are supporting the positive benefits of our restoration efforts in these coastal marshes. We're seeing a positive response from the native plant communities, and the good thing is 4 to 5 years out, these are from the channels from the FEMRA funding I mentioned earlier, they're still open. These channels are still open 4 to 5 years down the road, and they're supporting minimal cattail, so that's really good news. And we've also been able to reestablish the connectivity, which is allowing for those channels to stay open. And managed sites, so areas where we have the capability of controlling the water levels, are supporting a greater response from some of our target species. But of course, as any research project would say, we need more data and more time to really evaluate this. So with that, we'll save questions for the end, but I thank you for your time and turn it back over to Jason.
Thanks, Sarah. Our next speaker is Roy Kroll. Roy is a manager of conservation programs for Ducks Unlimited. He has educational background in natural resources and wildlife management, over 25 years of experience managing Winus Point Marsh Conservancy and the Winus Point Marsh Shooting Club. He's responsible for DU's conservation programs in the state of Ohio, including the Lake Erie Lands Protection Program. Roy's going to speak more to the methods used to restore hydrology to a Lake Erie coastal marsh. Roy?
Good afternoon. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about some methods that we think are quite adaptive in terms of restoring Lake Erie hydrology and coastal marsh at Middle Harbor, Ohio. And Middle Harbor is located on the south shore of Lake Erie, over near the Catawba and Marblehead peninsulas that jut out just north of Sandusky Bay. And they're in the western basin of Lake Erie. And as you can see, we have a unique ecology in the western basin and our unique set of problems, including our sediment plumes from clay soils, and also our ever-increasing loads of phosphorus into Lake Erie. There's probably a lot of folks in the room that are familiar with Lake Erie, but Kurt and I had to decide who was going to give the introductory talk and how fast we could do it, and so I got stuck with it. Lake Erie coastal wetland extent, as you all may know, is directly related to Lake Erie water levels, which are coming down primarily from the upper lakes. And then Lake Erie water levels fluctuate almost constantly. But I've broken them down into time periods just for the sake of conversation into short, medium, and long term. And short term fluctuations can be anything from summer rainstorms and stormwater events to seiches, which I'll talk about in a minute. They're wind-driven fluctuations. Medium period fluctuations would include the graph to the left, which is the blue line is the annual average water level of Lake Erie for about a 150-year period. And then there's seasonal fluctuations of Lake Erie, where it has its peak during the year in June and the low point in January. Long-term fluctuations can be anything from a year or two or a few decades, obviously where they're above or below the long-term average. And getting back to seiches, which are the wind-induced water level changes, although they may only last a day or two or three, they can be some of the most damaging effects of all the water level fluctuations. Seiches are often explained by the bathtub analogy that's at the bottom graphic there, where the water essentially blows from one end of the lake to the other. And if you're on the end of the lake that gets the high water, during one of the high water years and a record storm, you can be in a lot of trouble. Commonly, these are northeast to southwest winds, in alignment with the Lake Erie's alignment. And very frequently, you get 3-foot changes in water levels in 24 hours, and that's not any big deal. Everybody that's had a boat or any activity around Lake Erie knows about that. But when you have a record session, you can have 8 feet of water level difference on the location you're standing at. And in a northeast storm, the southwest end of the lake really takes a beating. These are accompanied by 12 to 18-foot waves. As you can imagine, it has a terrific effect on coastal wetland vegetation that's rooted. So the effect of all these fluctuations are that the natural historical pattern of coastal wetlands is that they are transient wetlands, and that they moved lakeward, moved landward when the water levels are high, and they move lakeward when water levels are low. And the Ohio Coastal Atlas depicts where the original extent of pre-settlement coastal wetlands used to be, which is between Toledo and about Huron, Ohio. And actually they still remain in that same area primarily, but much reduced in size and ecological functions. There are also landscape level factors that enter into this proposition. Much of northwestern Ohio was deforested, channelized, and tile drained. An area of over 5 million acres, almost 5 million acres, including the Maumee River watershed and the Great Black Swamp, which was between 1 and 2 million acres, depending on whose estimate you believe. And once settlement occurred, flood control dikes were built for agricultural and municipal purposes. We had the introduction of carp in the 1880s, which increased turbidity in all the shallow water areas of the western basin, and had an effect that I think is still underestimated today. And also we have geologic subsidence going on in the western basin, where it's dropping about a foot per century due to isostatic rebound and the glaciers, all that stuff that you probably all know about. And in addition, the Lake Erie marshes on the southwest end have a steep hydrological gradient for a coastal wetland system. And that was brought out by a study by Mitch and Wang in 1998, where they plotted the extent of the wetlands that would occur in the highest water levels inland and then the lowest water levels lakeward. And they came up with this figure, and the yellow portion shows that extent, and it really shows you how little area they have to move. And with this, they coined the frame that Lake Erie marshes have no place to go. But we don't agree with that completely. Also, the importance of landscape alterations had a significant effect. The landward migration was blocked during the high water years, which equal wetland loss. And in order to sustain emergent marshes, dikes, pumps, pipes, and other water level control devices were required, so that in the graphic on the right, you see we're relegated to essentially either pumping out or pumping in, based on what the Lake Erie water level is. And that's not an optimum scenario. The ecological benefits within these managed marshes with water level control areas being used are significant. They provide incredible habitats for a wide variety of species and processes, but they're not transported through the ecosystem. The benefits are mainly occurring in the impoundments, depending on the amount of water exchange with Lake Erie. If we look at some of these factors over time, it's a graph from 1860 to 2012 about, and prior to 1860, coastal marshes in southwest Lake Erie were essentially private land and supported a true subsistence culture. At the same time, the first duck hunting clubs were beginning to purchase wetlands. for their operations. And so that's how far back some of the maintenance of wetlands goes related to duck hunting clubs. By 1890, carp had been introduced. The Great Black Swamp is now drained farmland, most of northwestern Ohio. The flood protection dikes were there by 1900, restricting the landward advance of the wetlands. Then after a period of sustained low water in through the Dust Bowl era, in which landowners could go out to the farthest extent of their property on the shoreline and sort of reclaim their property by building a dike. Dike marshes became very common in Lake Erie, and again, they used water level control to keep the wetlands on the map in that particular location. By 1950, the science-based wetland management came into play. It definitely had a waterfowl focus, and at that time we started to see state and federal organizations begin to acquire large tracts of wetlands that are all now very famous and well visited by the public sector. And by 1970, the ecological shortcomings of these largely impounded wetlands were well publicized. This had a fisheries focus, and northern pike were generally the target species of all the controversy. But since 1970, we've had around 30 years of varying high water and northeast storms that eliminated most coastal marshes in southwest Lake Erie, including the ones protected by dike and armor stone. It was a very severe event and it increased, and continued over that 30-year period in different phases. And it launched an era of intensive wetland restoration that in some respects continues today. And almost all Lake Erie coastal wetlands on the southwest shore are impounded to some degree. Then the last 10 or 12 years, lake levels have been at or below the long-term average and demonstrated that the natural reestablishment of diverse wetlands that we were hoping would occur when these mudflats were exposed by receding water levels just didn't happen on a long-term scale. First couple of years looked great. We had plant diversity and interesting species coming up, but then Phragmites just came in and just dominated everything, and now we have vast stands of Phragmites leading away from the edges of the dike marshes, essentially. However, it's not all bad news. Existing dike marshes now have some opportunities to increase their ecological contributions to the ecosystem because the water levels are low enough now that existing plant communities will probably be sustained with Lake Erie hydrology in a lot of the locations that they exist. Now obviously it's elevation dependent, and we can have maybe a 3 to 5 foot difference in where wetlands occur naturally under Lake Erie hydrology. So there's some concerns there. But definitely the potential exists to install structures that restore Lake Erie hydrology and maintain the desired emergent plants. So we took that opportunity to work with a project through GLRI, and it's down on the bottom of that. You probably can't see number 12, but at the south shore of Lake Erie, Middle Harbor. And the need for restoration at Middle Harbor was recognized quite a while ago, including by the folks at Ohio Division Wildlife Fisheries Section. I mean, it's sort of a perfect scenario where it's a large wetland, has little or no hydraulic exchange, little or no aquatic vegetation. It's adjacent to relatively high quality waters, Lake Erie, West Harbor, and East Harbor. East Harbor is a wetland open to Lake Erie. And the fact that it was only 3 feet deep and had very turbid water, no plant growth, and that there would be no dike construction needed, which eliminated a lot of our permit problems, really put it high on the scale of to-do projects. And you can tell just from this graphic the the turbidity difference between Middle Harbor and the rest of the waters. Again, West Harbor to the west is highly used by boat marinas and condominiums and cottages, highly populated during the summer. East Harbor State Park to the southeast has the campground in Ohio with the highest rates of use. So we had a real good opportunity to affect change in an area that a lot of people would benefit from. And the project itself would be the construction of a water conveyance and control structure, including a removable pump. We'd restore 350 acres of marsh and then eventually open that to fish passage and hydrologic exchange from Lake Erie. It's funded by an NOAA grant and Ohio DNR match. And up to this point, it's been a great partnership. In some respects, the Middle Harbor project is just an adaptation of old restoration and management water level control techniques to provide broader ecosystem benefits that correlates with a drop in water levels. But the project had four components. Basically, we have to first design and build the structure. This is where DU engineering came in, and we have a very innovative crew of engineers, and we put together a structure that I think is going to be copied down the road quite a bit. Next, we have to establish the wetland plant community. We have to get that 3 feet of water out and draw down the water level, expose the soils, let the annual seeds grow that are in moist soil condition. That will take a year or two, we know, or maybe 3 to get down to that more hemi-marsh, perennial dominated picture at the bottom. And then we will be able to open the gates to restore Lake Erie hydrology. The fourth component is to monitor everything, as true with our NOAA friends. And the last thing is that the long-term goal for the project was to have Lake Erie hydrology sustaining high-quality coastal marsh. We were able to build this project on an existing dike, apply riprap, build a cofferdam to limit wetland impacts, build 2 4-foot wide and 8-foot deep channels or bays to let fish pass through, and also had to build a road on top of it for the park staff to access. And this is a view of the structure more or less from the lake to the bay, where we have debris screens or carp screens in place that can be removed completely or replaced at different times of the year. And Kurt's going to talk a little bit about that in terms of trying to keep carp out of the marsh during the peak of their activity, because they have significant effects on turbidity. Structure is the pump is electrically powered and hydraulically driven and has a variable speed. The structure was completed on the 1st of June, but we had to delay the drawdown because it was going to be timed with the essentially the peak of activity at East Harbor State Park, and we were going to have some inevitable fish kill problems during that 100-degree period, even though we were going to have a fish removal effort. But the structure is very versatile and gives us a lot of options for marsh management. The monitoring aspect of the program is a joint program with Erie Marsh, which is about 30 miles to the northwest. Going to do classic water quality sample metrics, species abundance and diversity for vegetation, fish, herps, and birds. And one chart here shows that gizzard shad comprise most of the fish in the degraded Middle Harbor wetland, whereas the control site, East Harbor, has a much more representative and healthy composition of fish species. And the establishment now that we've got the structure built, over this winter and spring, we will draw down the water by gravity and using open flows and sesh activities. In spring, we'll pump almost all the water out to expose the mudflats and germinate seeds. We'll provide a reservoir for mussels and provide a live fish removal effort. And we may need to aerially seed a cover crop because we know that areas like this that have been washed out for 30 or 40 years often have very poor seed banks. And then we'll reflood this seed cover crop over the summer, encourage perennials this year, and then next year do a partial dewatering to really establish perennials, which will be much more resilient to 2 or 3 foot water levels permanently that would be coming in through Lake Erie hydrology. So that's it. Thank you all for your partnerships and participation, and that's Middle Harbor.
Well, last but not least, our third speaker is Kurt Kowalski. Kurt's a research scientist for USGS. He's got an educational background in natural resources policy and behavior, geography, and aquatic ecology. He has 16 years experience conducting Great Lakes coastal wetland research at the USGS Great Lakes Science Center. Kurt will continue our presentation on coastal wetland rehabilitation and habitat connectivity. Kurt, pull up your talk here.
While you cue that up, I'm going to correct Roy a little bit.
Oh.
We didn't draw straws, we flipped a coin. Thank you, Roy, actually. So thanks for this opportunity to come and talk to you today. I'm going to be up here a little bit and walking a little bit, so again, please let me know if you can't hear me well enough. But I'm going to be talking a bit about some restoration and research going on in a place called Crane Creek and the fair context that work is going on in western basin of Lake Erie, building off a lot of what Roy was talking about. Certainly want to recognize the co-investigators on the project, Dr. Mike Wiley at the University of Michigan, and also Doug Wilcox at SUNY Brockport. And also, what I can't put up here are all the names of all the people behind the scenes collecting data and analyzing and so on. So I certainly want to recognize those important people. So this project, Crane Creek, and this talk today isn't just about this project. It's about a broader landscape effort to think about coastal wetland habitat restoration strategies across the basin. So this is a digital elevation model of the basin. Cool color scheme, lots of neat stories we could talk about and look at this for quite a while. But let me just point your attention to these 3 areas, these 3 large embayments here. Western Lake Erie, Saginaw Bay, and then the Green Bay area. These are very similar in many ways, glacial lake plains, so generally lower slope, clay, silt sediments, and that generally has led to extensive wetland resources through time. Well, that's also very good agricultural habitat, agricultural uses, agricultural production. Therefore, as the landscape changed for agriculture, ditching, draining, lots of negative impacts on wetlands through time. You also, for those that think of that way, you also think that a lot of the areas of concern, EPA-designated areas of concern, occur within these general zones. So that's why this work at Crane Creek, which is down here in western Lake Erie, is working to tackle some of these issues in a much broader landscape. So I'm going to quickly give you a little introduction, again, building off what Roy talked about, and then give you a little bit of discussion about what we're seeing with nutrient loading and water chemistry, nutrients, fish assemblages, and then wrap it all together and broaden back out to that landscape perspective at the end here. So this project is really focused on sustainable strategies for restoring wetland function, fish and wildlife habitat, water quality or nutrient cycling, sediment deposition, those types of things, and restoring the processes that drive those functions. It's very much a partner-driven project, extensive work with and support by Fish and Wildlife Service, you'll see why, Ducks Unlimited as well, and then several academics, and lots of support beyond by many organizations you guys probably represent in the room here, from Nature Conservancy, state agencies, and so on. So a lot of group effort going into the restoration work and then understanding what that restoration means and how it's going. So this place called Crane Creek, where is Crane Creek? Well, it's in the western basin of Lake Erie. Excuse me, this is one of the many, it represents one of the many tributaries in this area. So Crane Creek flows down through here, into a mixing zone here where there are a few remnant coastal wetlands, and you can't quite see it, but right there is an opening out into Lake Erie. So Lake Erie and the watershed are driving the hydrology of this system. Lots of these straight lines that you see here are the earthen berms, the dikes that Roy was talking about. So this is a quite classic look at the landscape. This is within the Maumee River area of concern, the broader region, and also the yellow outline here is the Fish and Wildlife Service, Ottawa National Wildlife Service boundary. Thus, our work is within the boundary. Now, I'm not going to focus on a whole lot, but I would point your attention to this pool 2B and 2A here. These two units are diked wetlands that the research I'm going to be presenting here is based on. And the names are not important, but when I talk about diked wetland or not, have this picture kind of in your mind. Here's a conceptual diagram of what Roy was discussing and what we see here at Pool 2B and lots of other places up and down the landscape. So we have Crane Creek on the left here and the diked wetland on the right. So there's lots, in generally, and many of these diked wetlands, lots of emergent vegetation. Water levels are able to be managed, so you can get good vegetation communities in many cases, oftentimes. And in 2B, the water quality is much clearer, lower turbidity. You have reasonable abundance of fish, but it's more of an inland fish community, so it doesn't really reflect what's going on out in Lake Erie. So you have a lot of bluegills and sunfish and bass and that type of thing. It's separated by a big earthen berm from what's going on out in the remnant coastal wetland. Draining agricultural landscape, there's lots of turbidity, there's carp out here. We have still a high variety of fish species out here, and these images are courtesy of Michigan Sea Grant. So lots of fish, lots of biota going on out here, as well as many stressors with the turbidity and invasive species representing here with Phragmites. So separated by that earthen berm. So this project is focused on working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and other partners to put a structure in place and then monitor and to evaluate the response of the ecosystem to this management action in several different ways and very intensely in several ways. Looking at fish and the avian community and lots of different components that I'd love to talk to you about, but I can't just because of time. So today I'm just going to focus on water chemistry and the fish assemblages. There's a lot more story to tell here. So let me start this part by giving you a little more information about the fish passage structure. So it looks similar to what Roy was talking about earlier, about 10 feet wide, essentially reconnecting that diked wetland back to the drivers that are ecological drivers out in Crane Creek. And is designed essentially as an open passageway here to allow free flow of water and biota back and forth between the two systems. So it's open all the time, but I don't see. There are gates that are now in here that do allow it to be disconnected if need be. So what that does, back to this schematic, is it reconnects those two. So all of the fish and other biota here are now able to access this good habitat back here, and you also have that pulsing of water back and forth as well. So one of the questions, we looked at water chemistry and water quality in lots of different ways, but one of the questions we had is when we have this SACE activity, so these short-term water levels, water pulses into and out of this wetland. Well, what does it do once the water comes into this nice wetland habitat and back out again? We have a good idea what wetlands do, but that was one of our questions. So we looked at the water chemistry during many different SACEs. One just represented here. This is just date across the bottom, and this is elevation. This is just the, I believe, hourly water levels. So we collected water when it was coming in, and then when it was leaving. And so what you're seeing is the result of about a 24-hour period in April. And it's been really interesting for us because this is not the early focus of the work, but we're seeing some very interesting results so far in water quality. So turbid water pulsing in and pulsing out over a 24-hour period in April, we're seeing total phosphorus here. So these are phosphorus graphs, concentrations, milligrams per liter here on the left. So total phosphorus, we're getting somewhere around 0.27 mg per liter. with a reduction about 63% of the concentration in that 24-hour period of that water pulsing back out. And comparable numbers you see in the soluble reactive phosphorus or orthophosphate. Some people like to focus on that more. So big reduction. So that's a pretty interesting story that we're seeing in this. I don't think I said it's about 100 acres or 40 hectares in size for this wetland. So what does that mean for retention? How much is staying in there? So based on the discharge and volume of water moving back and forth, we estimate about 17 kilograms or 50% of the total phosphorus that pulsed in did not pulse back out, is being retained in there. So this is a very interesting story that we're teasing apart, collecting a lot more data on to try to figure out what this means in the big picture, especially in the Maumee River area of concern and up and down the landscape as these restoration projects, habitat restoration projects move forward. There could be some interesting benefits also to water quality. We talk a little bit about fish here. We looked at fish composition, so what's there, abundance, how many, or the biomass, how much, and then the flux. So how are those fish moving now that they're reconnecting back to some habitat that looks pretty similar to what they used to be able to access. Really quickly, we use spike nets set multiple days, every other week for extended period of time, and then we also use some sonar for me to be able to show you these. So this is species richness. We've seen a huge response in species richness and abundance, which I'll show you in a minute. So this is a number of species on the y-axis here, spring, summer, and fall. First look at the white, which is the diked wetland. So that's before it was reconnected. So they're pretty similar, kind of down here around the 12 range, something like that. And then when it was reconnected, it was opened in March of 2011. All right, so this is kind of before, and the after is the green, which went way up, and now looks a whole lot more like the blue, which is Crane Creek, which is a coastal wetland. So species richness went way up. A lot of those new species were those that are found in the lake, the critical prey fish for walleye and other big guys, the emerald shiners and the gizzard shad and other species commonly found out in the lake. So that one didn't work. Let's see if it, that's my blank slide from the plenary this morning. All right, so let me just go back here. So the next slide is something similar that shows abundance. And essentially the bottom line with the abundance is that there was several orders of magnitude greater abundance after it was reconnected. So tremendous amount of fish moving in through that one structure to access the habitat in the formerly diked wetland. We documented reproduction of northern pike and a number of other very interesting species. So it's a really exciting story from the what's there and the how many are there side of the story. From the movement, the flux side, we were able to put into place and continue to put in place the sonar, the dual frequency identification sonar, which is essentially a high resolution acoustic camera. Think of it as a proxy for light-based camera. So it isn't impacted by turbidity or night or day. Produces images like this. I have a whole nother presentation. I can show you lots of neat images like that. But the bottom line is we're able to see through the water column when the fish are accessing. They're accessing it all the time. Lots of fish. Not lots of fish all the time. There are times when there are not so many fish, but they're moving in, they're moving out. Different species are doing different things. And so that has some big implications if we think about when a structure might need to be open if fish habitat is the primary objective. So we're still sifting through this data and trying to make sense of it, but very interesting story on how fish are accessing it and when. So let me pull this all together here. So all this work is based on the construction of that fish passage water control structure to reconnect the drivers and the pulsing water levels and the hydrology back to the diked wetland. Have great impact on the water quality in the system, phosphorus, nitrogen, lots of things that I can't show you, but very interesting story developing.
You have been watching a session on Great Lakes restoration right here on Great Lakes Week and greatlakesnow.org. We're happy to have